kind of spelled out the prop, but for anyone that doesn't know, for this debate, Jacob's taken the position that there are no rational reasons which lead one to a necessary or justified belief in the Christian God. Brandon's taken the opposition. Same criteria. If there's no concession, then we'll just put it to a voting poll where you guys can vote on who you think made the better case for their position. And just real quick, do either of you want any moderation for the debate?
I guess just light moderation is fine.
Yeah. If I start being a jerk and talking over you, just someone let me know. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, you guys can get started. Thank you both for debating.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for agreeing to debate. And so I watched Dayon Teleologist debate with Dr. Batman or Mr. Batman, and I enjoyed that debate. I thought there were a few things that I thought of that I might want to say in such a debate, or like just thoughts that sort of came to mind. So I thought I would put out forward sort of a proposition along these lines. So how can we have a justified belief in God? The role of reason and faith has been, I guess, fraught over the years. We can go through a whole history of this idea, but there are those of a sort of a philosophical bent who believe that there are arguments that will convince you that God exists, and not just, convince you like you were taken in by, like a charlatan or some fast wordplay or rhetoric or something, but, logically convince you in a sound and reasonable manner of God's existence. So there are a number of famous arguments like this: the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, various, like the argument from motion. There are various arguments that we could go through. And I think that these all necessarily fail because they speak to what is outside of all possible or any possible experience. That ultimately in our statements, we can only really speak about things that we can perceive, that we could possibly perceive, could possibly interact with. That statements about the ultimate reality of things in itself are simply impossible to make. And certain arguments and questions like what happened before the beginning of time, or what is outside of space, these questions are in some sense unanswerable because they are category errors. You're using a temporal category before to ask a question about what happened before time. So you can't ask that question reasonably without, invoking a temporal sense of the word. And similarly, if you talk about what's outside of space, you have to invoke a spatial metaphor, a spatial word to talk about that. And thus, our minds are really incapable of picturing or understanding, grasping that which is outside of time and space. So while God may exist out there, no argument in this way could convince me, I don't think, reasonably of God's existence. I think there are other sort of paths of religious doctrine that have faith, this sort of irrational principle, perhaps love, perhaps a leap that you have to take, something like that. Reason may be the handmaid of faith in some conceptions, but it can't get you all the way there. You'll always need a leap. And I would say this leap is not justified from the arguments that I've heard, any arguments presented. And, I would say that while an argument could come along, my interlocutor could provide such an argument in this debate, and I would be willing to change my mind should such an argument appear. I think it is in the very nature of such arguments to speak outside of what can possibly be spoken about, unless they do all ultimately fail. So, yeah, I guess with that, Brandon, do you have anything you want? add
All
or
right.
take away.
So, like I said, I think I'm going to take a completely different approach to what you probably expected for this debate proposition. But first of all, we should probably establish, because you're saying there are no rational reasons which lead one to a necessary or justified belief in the Christian God. That would be disproven if I came up with one rational reason which led somebody to a necessary or justified belief in God. Is that a reasonable standard?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Now, I would sort of just make clear what I mean by that. Now, there could be something that gives evidence towards that
Mm-hmm.
conclusion, but not one that would be, uh, enough evidence or good enough evidence to take the conclusion outright, I would say.
You're right. You're right. So what I would probably say is, first of all, like proposition doesn't necessarily require somebody to prove that God exists. If they could have some other necessary or justified belief in the Christian God. So, for example, let's say you're a parent and your child just died of cancer and you're in a deep depression and you're considering suicide, right? Um, and then a belief in the Christian God, which you might come to, could give you some sort of hope and make you, I don't know what the word is, but it would make you come to peace with the situation, and therefore you would no longer desire killing yourself. So I would say in this scenario, the belief in God would be necessary for their survival in a sense. So, and I also think that would be justified.
Um, so how can something be true just because it's necessary for your survival? There could be things that are
No.
true that kill you, things that are
Mhm.
untrue that could help you survive.
Well, the proposition isn't about whether or not it's true, it's whether or not the belief is necessary or justified, right?
Sure, but I guess I
Right.
would try to specify about what makes a justification good or not. I wouldn't say that just because you can offer some rationalization for it, that that rationalization is worth taking as like a justification. It's such a, it would need to be vetted, right? So we could look at that explanation. We could see that, a belief that is justified simply on the virtue that it is going to help me live versus not like versus going to make me die is maybe something that's nice to believe, maybe something I wouldn't want to yank away from you, but certainly not a justification for believing that it is true.
Mhm. But it even needs to be necessary or justified. So, do you not think that this belief would be necessary? Assuming that they've
No, because
already
I think
been
that
looking at
I
everything
think
else.
for a
They are like,
belief to be necessary, you would need to believe it as necessarily proven based upon the argument. Right? So you haven't provided any arguments to say it's necessary. It might be quote unquote necessary or else you will kill yourself, or necessary or else something else, like necessary for something else to happen. But that's only a hypothetical necessity. That's not a categorical necessity that would exist, or at least, like, maybe I'm just using those terms incorrectly, but it's not a necessity that would exist as a result of a logical argument, any
well,
justification. That's merely
it
like,
would be pretty logical. It would be if you believe in God, you get to survive. So it would be necessary for your survival, and or we could come up with some other reason that a belief in God would
sure,
be
sure, but like
necessary
you could
for.
have a
So
belief that was
it's not
necessary
about,
for you to get coffee in the morning, but
hmm
just because
but
you got
it's
coffee in
not
the morning
about
with this
it being
belief.
necessarily true, right? It's just if it's necessary for something.
Oh, okay. So when I say like a statement would be necessary, I would mean that it would necessarily follow from a set of uh, like a syllogism, right? The conclusion of a syllogism follows necessarily from its premises.
Well, I guess it would be like P1. Um, you want to live. P2, if you believe in a Christian God, you will live P3. If you do not believe in a Christian God, you won't live. Conclusion. In order to continue living, belief in a Christian God is necessary. And like that
Sure,
is
but
perfectly
your conclusion
valid
there
and
was contingent.
coherent
Your
because
your
like
conclusion there was an if-then statement.
mhm,
So what
like
if
with
I simply
I'm
don't
saying
want to
if the
live?
premises are true, because there
W-
could be a
Like you're
scenario
saying it's necessary
where
for that. I
somebody
agree that like to if I want to have my shoes on, I should like untie, put my foot in the shoe and then tie it up again, right? That might be necessary for me to do to put on my shoes. But if
mhm.
I don't want to put on my shoes, I'm under no obligation to untie and then retie my shoes.
Yeah, I'm just
So
talking
similarly,
about a
you would be
person
under
in
no if
which
you don't want to
these
live.
premises would be true for, because
Okay,
you say
but under
there are no
so
rational
under your
reasons
premise,
which lead one to a necessary or
hmm,
justified belief. So it's just about one person, or any person, right?
okay, but
So if some,
that one person, um, so you're saying if that one person wanted to live, and the only way they could live was to believe in God, a Christian God, then they
or if
wouldn't
that is the
necessarily
only
have to
conceivable way
believe in
they
that
can
God
imagine
if
living.
they didn't want to live or not. I mean, so I
It,
agree that it would be necessary if they wanted to live for the purposes of living, but that is not a justified reason to believe whether or not that is the case. It's
well,
not a justification.
that's not what like a belief in God has to be. That would be a belief that God is in fact in existence. You can have a belief in God without having proof of God, right? And this would still be a necessary belief in God, and I would say it would be coherent
So,
because
so what
that's
kind
what
of
you said.
belief can you have in
That's what
God
you
that's
mean by.
not somehow a belief that he exists?
But you can believe that He exists without proof, right?
So I'm
Because
not
I mean,
talking about
otherwise,
believing in the concept of God, because clearly the Christian concept of God, like roughly exists. If you want to believe the
no. But
concepts
I'm saying
exist,
you can believe that He exists without having proof. Because if we go down to
so
yeah,
you
like
can,
the only
but it
thing
would
we can
be
have
unjustified
certainty
for
of,
you.
the only thing we can have certainty of is I think, therefore I am, right? And everything else is just, well, it seems that this is the case, but we would still have a belief that it is the case.
But normally those beliefs are somehow justified. So
I would say this
I
is
would be
justified.
willing to accept a number of types of arguments to justify a belief, right? Like an empirical argument or rational argument or some kind of
hmm
deduction. Or, there are arguments you could give.
But a
You can make it.
justification doesn't necessarily need a proof. You can have a different justification. For example, the example I gave you, it would be justified for you to have this belief without you having to prove anything.
Right. So I agree you don't always need an empirical proof to have a justification, but
Yeah.
I would say that simply believing something as necessary to you living is not one such justification.
I mean, let's say that this person, their kid just died. They are on the top of a building, right? And they're like just about to jump off. It's like a really high building or whatever. And they look at their phone, and then suddenly, like they're just like about to message people their goodbyes, and then they see some sort of thing about God, and then they're like, wow, and they have an epiphany. And because of that, right before they were about to die, um, that belief in God was necessary for their survival, right? So that I would say the chances of
Sure.
them
Sure, but
living
why are
without that
you
belief in God would be extremely minuscule.
hmm, hmm. So I agree with pretty much everything you've said, but I just disagree that that would make that statement justified or true. It might be um, a practical of practical use, to assume that
Yeah.
stance.
It doesn't need to be true to be necessary or justified, though, which is the proposition.
Um, so I don't think you have established, though, that it is justified to believe something simply because it's practically convenient for you to do so.
Well, should we get a definition of justified?
Sure. Yeah.
All right,
Um,
I'll look one up.
okay. So, like, you could believe something for reasons, right? But if those reasons are good or if those reasons are bad, would I think, lend credence to your
So,
justification? So
do
we
you
could say
agree
that,
to this definition?
if
Having
I
done
if I
for or
murder
marked
someone
by a
and
good or
then,
legitimate reason?
uh, sorry, can you say that again? I was talking.
Would you agree to this definition? Having done for or marked by a good or legitimate reason?
Um, sure. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so would you consider um, wanting to live as a good or legitimate reason?
Not for believing something to be the case, no.
Why would it not be the case that it would be? It's not about what it's trying to justify. It's about whether or not this is a good or legitimate reason for something.
Sure, sure. So, for instance, in this conversation, we're not to get too meta, but we're having this conversation about something. We're asking, is it the case? Now, hopefully, we're asking, is it the case based on what we think to be the case, and not simply what we are motivated to believe based on, what we think will cause us to live, right? If I
Wait,
am,
by what being the case that God
if I
exists?
am, right, so if I am, let's say, being tortured by an evil man, and he says, say this falsity and I will let you live. Say the truth, I will kill you. Right? Do that. What is the truth and what the falsity are in those scenarios then suddenly flip because there's now a threat on your life?
No, you would just be justified in saying the falsity, right?
Well, you would be justified to the extent that you're trying to save your life, but you wouldn't be justified in believing that falsity to be the case.
But it's not necessary for you to believe that in order to survive. It's only necessary for you to say it in order to survive. So it's not
Okay, but we're
necessarily
talking about
analogous to
belief in a Christian
my
God, are we
situation.
not?
Yeah, but it's
We're
not
talking about belief in
analogous
a Christian
to
God
my
then.
hypothetical. Yeah, but the
So,
belief, wait, the belief itself would be necessary in my hypothetical. In your hypothetical, it's not necessary to believe the falsity, it's only necessary to say it.
okay, so if in the scenario, maybe the torture is more prolonged, he's like brainwashing. In order to escape alive, you will have to accept this falsity as true um, somehow in your psychology. Would that now make it
hmm
true?
It wouldn't make it true, it would make it a justified belief.
Oh, um, I don't think it would be a good reason to believe that.
Well,
Like, I think that,
the reason would
within the
be that you don't
brainwashing,
want
there
to
would be some
die.
kind of like
Yeah,
negative, damaging trauma that would probably cause you to
right. But do you think
something
that
true, think
wanting to
something
live is
justified.
a good reason?
Wanting to live is not a good reason, no, to believe something to be the case.
So, okay, I guess we just disagree on that. I think that if you had no choice uh, in terms
Right.
of survival, but to believe something, then it would
So,
be
I might
justified for you
really
to
want
believe
to
that
try.
because survival is like the only thing that, when it comes down to it, any species or person really
Survival.
cares about. Like, yeah,
I
that's
mean,
like
so is that like a
programmed into
Darwinist
us.
view then?
Yeah, I think like when it comes down to it, uh, a person will disregard any like uh, rationalization in terms of like, am I correct right now in order to survive? And I would say that that's justified.
Okay. So I would say that from a Darwinian point of view, you're not even necessarily designed with an intent to survive, right? The idea of
Hmm.
survival is like you really only need to survive long enough to um, uh, share your genetic material, and spread that, or help others do so. So,
Okay, well, your
it's
main
really more
purpose
about,
could we could
you know,
just change it so it's
like you can
necessary
immediately
for you
suicide
to
after you
spread
do
your
that, right?
genes. Yeah, sure. So their child's just died, so they still need to spread their genes. So it would be necessary to have this belief in order to spread their genes, as well as in order to survive, which I think are both legitimate reasons for doing something.
Hmm. So have you heard like the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson conversation on the nature of truth at all?
No? But we're not talking
Okay.
about truth, we're talking about justified or necessary beliefs. It
Okay.
doesn't matter if the belief is true or not.
Okay. So I would just say that you could be there could be justifications for it that might be motivating. They might be motivating enough for you to believe that, but they would not be good justifications. They wouldn't be justifications that would allow you to justifiably hold the notion that God exists, or God that is
Well,
a
the,
justified
the
notion.
definition of justified that we're going by is having done for or marked by a good or legitimate reason. So
Right. So that
if
reason
you
is
believe
neither
that
good nor legitimate.
okay, so this comes down to I think that wanting to survive and wanting to spread your genes is a good or legitimate reason, and you don't. I think that's what this comes
Right. I
down to.
would consider that motivated reasoning. So that
Hmm.
if you are motivated in your beliefs,
What would
then
be a good
by
reason?
that very definition,
For
you're sort of
this does
taking
not
things
talk about
outside
the
the fact.
conversation. This disregard the conversation we're having. What would be a good or legitimate reason for anything?
Good or legitimate reason, um,
Yeah.
you could have a large body of, let's say, empirical evidence to back up your claim.
So you're saying that the only way of you can have a
No,
justification for
no, you,
anything
you just asked me what
is
one way would be.
oh, okay. So that's just an example, but what would
So you
another
could
example be
also, let's
other
say,
than
say something
evidence
by the definition
or
of certain
proof?
terms.
Because you can have a justification for, I don't know, going to school, right? And then not have proof that going to school is going to
Right, right. So
is
I
the
agree that
correct
science
thing to
doesn't,
do, right?
right. So I agree that science doesn't always work according to, um, a linear progression of logical deduction, right? Of one thing, of course it doesn't. It has new theories. We make
Yeah,
leaps all the time in science.
yeah.
So what
But like
distinguishes
in this
one of those leaps
scenario,
from a,
right?
a leap of faith, right? And
We're
I would
talking
say that
about
that those leaps are made when a scientist has inference to the best explanation, uses
yeah.
abductive reason, not faith, not something motivated by the heart, but
I think you're
something
stuck
that
up in
is
one example of like a way in which something can be justified. Because what if the science can only serve as a justification given other parameters? Like, for example, is it true or not that you should go to school? And the science would be saying things like, okay, it is true that if you go to school, you will likely do better in life,
so
earn
so
more and
that's a
stuff. So
moral
wait.
question,
So these are the parameters that you would plug into that. So
right? So science
and
can't
it
answer
you
a
can't
moral question by the very definition.
you can't say whether or not those things like earning more and stuff are true because that's not something that can be like we can't say if it's true or false or not. So there can
So
be
science
things
can't answer like a
that
moral question by sort of the definition of science, right?
hmm
It's not
yeah.
asking
So you
what
can
you
have
ought to do. It's just
justifications
saying,
for things other than what science can actually prove.
sure, I would agree. You need
Yeah,
philosophy as well, and
yeah.
and
So we're
science comes
not
out of
just talking
philosophy.
about things that you need evidence for. There are things that don't necessarily need evidence, which you can provide a justification for and have legitimate reasons.
Sure, but those inferences to the best explanation are are based in my perception, my empirical continued observation of the world, and the coherence that they provide with all other assumed, all other knowledge, right? So it all has to work together in a coherent
Well,
manner.
I'm not talking about best explanations. You could have a justified belief in something that is
So,
not the best
and sort of
explanation.
furthermore, I wouldn't say that, it's sort of a foundationalist critique to look at beliefs as this linear thing, that one belief is going to be justified by another belief, it's going to be justified by another belief in sort of a chain, a linear. I take the notion of a coherentist model, which is a holism. So I would say that a whole belief system has to be looked at as a whole, and the way that these different parts interact with one another, and the way that it offers a coherent model of reality, of phenomenal reality, of perceptual experience. And
I'm not
for
sure what
any
you mean by that.
so what part was easy?
Like, what point are you trying to make?
What I'm saying is that we have to look, instead of looking at if our individual beliefs are justified in a kind of chain, we have to look at the whole view and see if it is coherent and justified in itself, and also comparing it to perceptual reality and experience.
Okay,
Because if
so
there's
in
a
this case,
discontinuity
what
there,
is the whole view and what is the individual belief? Just so I know what you're talking about.
so you'd look at, let's say, you're deciding which type of solar system, or like which type of solar model. You can either do the
Yeah.
Ptolemaic model, you can do like the updated Kepler model, right? And you're looking between these two things, and you're going to say, okay, so which offers the most coherent explanation of the phenomena, right? Which of these
Yeah, but
two
I
things
don't
is
see that
simpler?
as analogous. If the proposition was like, there isn't a necessary or justified belief that there is proof of God, then I think that would be analogous. But that's not the prop, because you can have a belief without having evidence or proof and have it justified, I think. Because I don't think proof or evidence is the only justification you can have for a belief.
So proof and evidence. So proof would be something maybe like a logical proof. Would you say that like you could know that bachelors are unmarried men simply by the meaning of those words?
Yeah, I mean with like 99.99% certainty or whatever. Sure.
No, all bachelors.
Yeah, but like for all I know, those words don't actually mean anything, and I'm just in like a simulation,
Which is why we've
and
assumed
the
the meaning of
words
those
just
words.
changed or something.
So I said, assuming the
Yeah,
meaning
you
of
have to
those
make an
words.
assumption.
Yeah, assuming the
Oh,
meaning of
okay.
those words, then
To my
100%.
knowledge, that is proven. Yeah,
No, you don't need to your knowledge. Oh, to your knowledge, that's proof? Okay.
that's proven.
Okay. All right. Okay, that seems fair. Okay. So my point is, there are many ways, I guess, beliefs could be justified. You could have an inductive, a deductive, or an abductive justification. But simply saying that this is better for my survival, this is going to be
I think
helpful
you're
for me.
talking about a
This,
different thing again. You're talking about ways in which you can like provide evidence logically.
well, what I'm saying is these are good ways to justify proof, because to say a bachelor is an unmarried man doesn't require any
Yeah,
evidence,
that is fine.
right?
That's to justify proof, but proof is separate from the proposition.
I guess what I'm saying is that if you believe in God and you don't have one of those justifications, either inductive, abductive, or deductive, then to simply say that it is for my benefit practically that I believe in God is maybe a practical justification, but is not a justification that that belief is in fact true. So it
Yeah,
could
I would
justify
agree with
your
that, but
practical
that is not the
life statement,
proposition.
right? So
Maybe
it could,
you should
so
redo the proposition and have it as there is not like a necessary or justified belief that there is proof of God's existence or something?
Um, I
Just
mean,
include the
perhaps
word
I
proof,
could
because
re-clarify,
that's not
and I
necessary.
thank you for
Yeah,
that. But
if you want to
I
have like a discussion about a discussion with somebody who actually wants to like provide evidence or proof for God's existence,
right,
then I
right.
think that would.
But I am interested in having, this epistemological discussion about justification with you. If, what, if you don't mind, like we don't need to go on forever, but like, what is it about simply believing something is necessary for your survival? Like, why should the truth alter itself like all the time based on the survival of individuals? That seems highly preposterous, right?
It's
And
not
then
the
I know
truth
you're not
altering
saying,
itself, it's the
well,
individual's belief.
why should your beliefs then alter themselves to fit with um, what's going to make you live? Just simply on the
So
fact
that you
that,
don't die without spreading your genes.
okay, so like, what about someone like Socrates who sought to die for his beliefs?
Well, that would have been like specific to him. Most people want to live.
Okay, but what if you saw that it was more valuable to die for your beliefs?
Yeah, if that was the case, then I would say then it wouldn't be necessary or justified for you to believe in God's existence.
Okay.
But that's not necessary. Like, it's not really.
So I guess,
It
like, I
doesn't
mean,
matter
we
to the
can say that
proposition because we just
there
need
is
it
a
to be.
kind of practical justification you might have for believing that in a very practical sense, that
Yeah.
you want to live and don't want to die. And so you've adopted this belief, this erroneous belief. But I would say that you still could not truly believe it. That
Why?
in a sense that you'd have to think two different things at the same time, both that you don't believe because you have no evidence to believe, but then also that you must believe somehow, so you like try to believe. Like,
Are you
it,
saying
to
that
me,
evidence is
belief.
necessary for a belief?
So like, belief would be like belief that something is the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you can believe that without evidence.
Right, but that wouldn't be justified.
Yeah, I just gave you a justification. It just
But
wasn't
that is not, I guess, the
evidence.
fact that
You're just saying that justification has to be one of these forms of like logical reasoning to
right,
provide
because the fact
evidence
that I
for it,
want
right?
something to
So
be the
by
case
if that's your
doesn't make it the
definition
case.
of if that's your definition of justification, then obviously because I'm not providing evidence or proof of the existence of God, right? But I
Okay.
don't think that's what justification is because we've already agreed to a definition. Let me find it again.
So, I mean,
Having
we could
done for
equivocate
or
over the
marked
notion
by
of
a good
justification.
or legitimate reason, right? And this doesn't say anything about evidence or proof. You can just have a good or legitimate reason. And again, it's just coming down to, do we see survival and spreading your genes as a good or legitimate reason to do something?
Okay.
And
All
I
right.
do.
Well, I would not. Right. So I would
All
say
right.
that there are many cases where simply believing something as convenient to yourself in a specific instance for your own benefit can
Well,
actually
it could be
lead
for
to
more
harms
people's
that will come
benefit
down the
as
line.
well. Like
Sorry?
it could lead to more benefit as well for other people. Like when you kill yourself, it's not just you that suffers, like your family, relatives, and stuff. And combining
Um,
that with their child that just died of cancer, like that's going to be a lot of suffering if they don't take on this belief.
sure, but you are under the assumption that one can simply take on or remove beliefs as if they were a coat, right? I would say that you can't simply
Yeah, maybe it's
believe
not
something that
simple.
you haven't
I'm
been
telling you that
convinced
they
of.
came to an epiphany and they suddenly just had this realization in their mind that God exists. Obviously, they don't have proof for that, but in their mind now, they do believe that God exists.
Okay. So in their mind, they suddenly came to this belief through maybe they
Hmm.
had like a mini stroke or something.
They
Okay.
had an
What?
epiphany.
Okay. Yeah, they had an epiphany. Um, when they reflect back on that epiphany, why would they consider it to be a genuine epiphany and not some kind of psychological episode?
It doesn't have to be a genuine epiphany or not. That's irrelevant
So
to
why
whether
would you
or not
believe
they
something
believe in
on
the Christian
so why
God
would you
at that
believe
time.
something on the basis of a non-genuine epiphany?
Uh, why couldn't you do that? It would still be necessary or justified.
So the fact that it would be a non-genuine epiphany, one that you would not take to be genuine, would
Like,
mean that it
what do you
wouldn't be
mean by
justified.
non-genuine?
So if you were to have like a hallucination where God came down to you,
Mm-hmm.
but you'd also taken some mushrooms earlier that day, you might be like, oh, that
Yeah, but now
epiphany
you're
was
just
actually just like
altering
the
my
mushrooms.
hypothetical. You're just
No,
altering
I'm
my
giving you
hypothetical.
another hypothetical to explain sort of my point here, which is like if
Yeah, let's
you
just say they didn't take mushrooms and came to an epiphany
okay,
or any
but if they
hallucinogen.
did, it would not be justified, right?
Why would it not be justified? It would just be
Because
incorrect.
there is like a likely other source where you're like, well, or let's say you are a schizophrenic. You know you're a schizophrenic.
Oh,
If God speaks to you,
yeah, I'm
you'd be
looking at the whole
justified in
picture.
being like, oh, that's
I
my
still think it's
schizophrenia.
justified to take a belief in God at that moment, because otherwise you're going to die and not be able to spread your genes. So it would still be justified. It would just be
Why should I care more about spreading my genes than the truth?
why is that matter? They think this is the truth.
So it seems to come down to their personal preference here for
What
their genes
to
over the
live and
truth.
pass their genes? I think that is the majority of people's preferences above all else.
Um, I would disagree. I think that other people, plenty of people don't want to have kids. Plenty of people can have kids. Plenty of people want to live lives, where
Okay,
they maybe
let's take the living one. I think most people want to live, at least.
sure some like most people, okay, but not all people. We can't say that
Yeah,
they're
that's
not.
besides the point. We're not trying to prove that it's a necessary or justified belief for all people. You just said, let me check the proposition real
Okay.
quick.
So you want to live. I mean, I
It
grant that people
says
want to live. I
lead
just
one
disagree that
to a
that's a good
necessary
enough
or
a
justified
reason
belief.
to believe something that is untrue. I think to be real about it, you have to be like Socrates. You have to die for your
No,
beliefs
but
if it
they
comes
don't
down to
know
it.
that it's untrue. They believe it to be true.
Well, they know that they have no justification for it
Um,
apart from wanting to believe it,
justification
in your
in
view.
terms of
Apart from
what?
what you consider to be this justification, they have no
So
other
you're saying
justification.
no, you're saying no evidence or proof, right?
No evidence, no proof, no, yeah, nothing.
Okay, I think they do have justification. They just don't have evidence or proof. Yeah.
Okay, so I would just say that, I don't consider personal desires, even if those desires are like reasonable, everyone shares them, I don't consider those to be a justification for a belief. I
Would it
think,
not be your personal desire to seek the truth?
a
Is that a
personal
good
desire to see the truth.
justification?
I agree that I
Hmm.
all men desire, all women, all people desire to know. I have a
Above all
desire for the
else,
truth. So,
or
hmm?
above all else? I don't think so.
um, I mean, we could get into the
But the
notion that
point is,
philosophy is the
we're not
highest end of
talking
man or
about if
something, but
everybody shares this. I'm just saying that it is your personal desire to know the truth, right? And you're taking your personal desire as a justification. So why can't you do that with a desire to live?
um, so I have not taken my desire for the truth as a justification. I've taken evidence that proves that it is true as a justification for, and I agree that all justifications are going to be looking
As a
for to find
justification to
satisfaction.
believe something that you have evidence for is because of your desire to seek the truth. Is that not the case? Because let's take two beliefs. They're contradictory. You can have a belief in God, or you cannot have a belief in God. And due to your desire to seek the truth, right, based on evidence, and you don't have any evidence of God, you would hold the belief that God doesn't exist, or you're agnostic to it, right? And that would be
Right,
based
because
on your desire
I'm
to
quite
seek the truth.
literally asking into the status of belief. I'm inquiring into whether or not it's good to believe in God or bad to believe in God. And I'm seeing that there are no reasons to believe that he exists.
Um, well, I gave you a reason to believe that he exists. It's not an evidence or proof, but your
Okay,
your
so
uh, your belief in agnosticism or atheism, right,
but
is
it's
based
not
on your
a reason to
desire
believe that
to
belief is
follow the
true.
evidence and truth, right? No, we're
So
not talking about whether or not it's true that God exists. We're talking about if there's a necessary or justified belief that God exists.
okay, but
Yeah?
beliefs are beliefs that something is true.
You do believe that it's true, but we're not talking about whether or not it is true.
So, but the justification for your belief that it's true, the, the, is that not what we're talking about?
Yeah,
So we're
but we're
talking
not
about
talking
the
about whether or
justification for the
not
belief that something is the
the
case is
belief is
true.
actually true or not. We're talking about if you believing that it's true is justified, not if the proposition is actually true or not.
Okay, so I agree that to want not to die, that's a kind of justification for your belief that
Hmm.
something is. So
It's also
that is a
necessary,
justification
right? If
to believe something,
would you agree that it's
but it's not a
necessary?
justification to actually believe that this thing is the case, that that this statement is actually true, right? It's a justification to
Um,
motivate your reasoning. It might give you reasons to assume this,
I disagree.
but I think this would actually go against your rational nature as a human being.
Okay, but
This
I,
is
I
going to
gave you a hypothetical
void
where
your
that
logic, right?
isn't the case. I did give you a hypothetical where that isn't the case, right? Where they had the epiphany. But
So to assume
s-
something simply for motivated
you
reasoning, I
no,
think
it's
would
not
jar you.
assuming. It's believing that it's the truth. Why do you believe
Okay,
that
to
there
believe
is no
baselessly
proof
or
of God's
simply with
existence?
the basis of wanting to live rather than a reason that would properly account for and cause. See,
Do you believe
there's
we're
no
having this
connection
conversation
between the
right
fact
now?
that you want to live. I guess there's no connection between the fact that you want to live and the fact that something is the case or is true. Whereas if you have seen it and you have evidence for it, or you've logically deduced it, something like that, then that would be, in fact, reasons that there would be some connection
Hmm.
there with those things and that thing
Do you
existing,
believe
right?
that we're having this conversation right now?
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any proof that we are having this conversation? Can you
I
be
have
100% certain that we're having this conversation?
no, I can't be 100% certain.
All right, so I don't see why it matters what you're saying. It can still be a justified belief
So I believe that
without
all knowledge is
you having
fallible
proof.
and that you can be wrong
Okay.
and still call it knowledge.
Oh, right, so you can be wrong about
You
whether
could
or
be
not
wrong.
God exists
Right.
and
Right.
still have it as fallible.
Right. You could have a justified and necessary belief in God, but then
Hmm.
still turn out to be wrong.
Oh, all right. I think you just conceded the proposition. You just said you
No.
can have a just. You just said you can
Right.
have a
But
necessary or
you haven't
justified
shown
belief in
me the
God,
justified
but be
or
wrong.
necessary belief or position.
But you just said yourself you can have a necessary or justified belief in God, but just be wrong, right? And the proposition is that there is no just necessary or
Sure. But the
justification
fact that
for
you
one's belief in God.
could have one doesn't mean that there is no one.
Okay, well, I gave an
So I was just
example,
using God
and
as an
I
example
think
because that's
that
what we're
this
talking about.
example
But you
that
could
I
have a
gave.
justified or necessary belief of anything, of the fact that the Earth is going around the sun, but then later it
Hmm.
could turn out to be wrong, right?
Yeah, true. And I would say that your belief that
Right, but it
the
would
Earth
still
is
be
going around the
knowledge.
sun
You were still
was
holding,
justified.
like the body of knowledge of like physics or astrophysics in your hand.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't see why that's relevant. Like, you have a
Right, so it's not.
justified belief
So like even if
in
you are
that
to clear
case.
the hoops here and win this debate and show that there is a justified and necessary reason for believing in God, then
Yeah.
that still doesn't mean that God exists, right? Because that
No, yeah, that's
belief, not
besides
justified
the
necessary belief, would
proposition, though.
simply be wrong.
The proposition isn't there is no proof of God's existence. So that's besides the point. That's fine. I'm not trying to prove that.
Okay. I mean, you are trying to show, though, that it would be a justified belief. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do understand you're not trying to show that he exists. But I guess I would say that beliefs should be justified on the basis of what exists rather than our preferences.
How do you know what exists? If you can just be wrong later on, find out you're wrong.
So I can't know in an absolute
Oh, all
100%
right.
certain
And
sense
you
alone,
and the same logic applies.
but
Somebody
I
could
can still
quote
be
unquote
justified
know
in
that
my
God
beliefs
exists and be
and make
wrong.
inferences for
Yeah,
the
and
best
be justified.
explanation. Simply use my
I
reasoning.
maybe we should make closing statements because I think we're just going round in circles at this point.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. Um, okay, so yeah, I mean, I should probably um, take a look at how I worded the prop so as not
Yeah.
to confuse anyone. But I think clearly we do have a disagreement about what is a good justification for a belief.
Hmm.
And simply asserting that we want to live, and this will give us somehow through magic in this hypothetical the ability to live, is not a justification to believe something. We have to die for our beliefs if we want to um, be consistent here, right? You don't want to just believe something or change your mind based on what is convenient for you in the moment. I think um, there were echoes of some kind of like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris discussion on the nature of truth here. I'm not, but I know you're not really making a quick claim about what's true, just what's justified. Um, I would say that it certainly, and we agree, not abductively justified, not deductively justified, not inductively justified, not any of those, but simply on the basis of wanting not to die. And, you know, that might be good enough for you to practically try your freaking hardest to assume that. But in that you are a rational person, you know what's true. You know what you have justification to believe. And you would know in your heart of hearts, you know justification to believe this. Simply doing so because you're a coward and you don't want to die, and that's totally fair, dude. But it's not a good enough reason.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's my closing statement. Thanks so much for debating, though.
No problem. I don't think I'll make a closing statement now. I just wanted to respond to that last point. I don't think it's just because you're a coward. In this case, they literally believe that now, and that's what stopped them from dying. So the proposition is that there are no rational reasons which lead one to a necessary or justified belief in the Christian God. So I think I presented my case that I think it would be justified, just not proven. But even if you don't think that it's justified, if you think that it's necessary for you to have this belief in the case that you're about to kill yourself because like your kid just died of cancer or whatever and you went through a serious depression and then you have an epiphany, I think that epiphany that God exists in your mind was necessary because obviously necessary is like a word contingent upon something else anyway, and I think it's fair to make it contingent upon survival, say it's necessary for your survival. Um, and let me quickly find the definition we agreed upon for
I guess.
justification. Um,
Oh,
so
okay. So can I just say one more
it
thing, and then if you want to
was.
respond, we can close.
Let me just quickly say. So our definition of justification was having done for or marked by a good or legitimate reason. And personally, I think wanting to survive or wanting to like spread your genes are like good and legitimate reasons to do something. I mean, we're not talking about pretending that you have this belief. You literally do have this belief now. So yeah, you can quickly respond, and maybe I'll have another response to it, and we can finish up.
Great. Yeah, I'm sorry for the breach of your closing statement there.
No problem.
So I guess just the notion that you could assess that something that believing something is necessary for your survival, that itself is an empirical statement, one that would be impossible to justify as a necessary one. You could say that with some probability, this is the way that I must go, like maybe like 90%, something like that. But you couldn't make the statement necessarily that this must follow from an
Yeah,
empirical stand. Okay.
yeah. I think just in this case it would be like 99.9% chance, and I think that would be good enough because of the usage of the word necessary to say it is necessary, because they were literally about to jump off of the building in this hypothetical, and
Cool.
they were sending their like messages to their relatives, and they were going to die, and then suddenly this belief they had saved them. So it was, I would say it was necessary.
Sure. Or like 99.9. Okay, that's all good.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks so much for debating.